Hello, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to the first McKay interview of the new decade. My subject today is education, something that I've not covered before in all the 8 or 9 years of this program, so it's not before time. Now, before I begin, I should declare an interest. I started my professional life more than 50 years ago, a distance in time that I find hard to believe, as a school teacher. I was educated and trained for the profession in England and then spent 2 years teaching in a Jesuit high school for boys in Kingston, Jamaica. It was a great experience. And then I left the profession, though it's always retained a special place in my heart. But that's another story. Many wise, many frivolous, and many harsh things have been written or said about education. Aristotle and Charles D. McKeever, an American late 19th century educator and crusader for women's education, are two of my favorites. McKeever said, when you educate a man, you educate an individual. But when you educate a woman, you educate a whole family. And Aristotle said the roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet. Now, in this open, free, innovative, and economically liberal society that is Switzerland, there are many choices available to parents and students throughout primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of schooling in the broadest sense. And it must be said that, generally speaking, the Swiss public education system is of high quality, thorough, rigorous, and extensive. And today I'm going to examine from a few different angles private education, and in particular the education provided by one well-known pioneer, the International School of Geneva, or Ecolint, or Ecolint, as it's called locally. I have today, unusually, not one guest, but two. The Director General of Ecolint, the top man, Dr. David Hawley, and one of his pupils, Antonia Molnar, though I was admonished once for misspeaking and was told that young people, at least in the upper echelons of secondary school, are nowadays called students. But why not? After all, mea culpa. And we're at the Châtaigneraie campus in Fune, Vaud, my home village for nearly 30 years. Welcome to the McKay interview, David. Good to see you.
Great to be here, Michael.
And it's nice to be back here again. And welcome to you, Antonia.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Antonia, you should know right at the outset that your very presence this afternoon has lowered the average age of my guests by 10 to 20 years. And you set a record for the McKay interview by being the youngest ever guest to be on my show. So congratulations, and I'm pleased, I'm grateful not only to you, David, but also because it was your idea, but I'm also grateful to you for accepting the invitation. So some listeners may wonder why, and in reply I would simply say, let's hear a youthful voice for the future, especially at the beginning of a new year and the start of a new decade. Though, dear listener, I should mention this is actually being recorded just before Christmas in case the truth leaks out. Let's begin at a very obvious place, David. Tell me a little more about yourself and how you ended up as the Director General here at Ecolint, and about the school. How many nationalities do you have here? How many kids? How many students go right the way through, say from 5 or 6 to 18 years of age? I'm curious to know the turnover of pupils. Just paint a picture for me, please.
Sure. I'll give you a couple of pictures and how did I end up here in Ecolint. Yeah. My most recent stop before Ecolint was as the Chief Academic Officer for the International Baccalaureate. The curiosity there is that the International Baccalaureate was born here at Ecolint in the 1960s, and looking out to look at other things to think about and do with my own career, I know that Ecolint and the International Baccalaureate really established international education in the 20th century. And the big question for me, and I think for Ecolint, is we would also like to be the pioneers and establish what does international education mean in the 21st century. Okay. So here we are with about 140 nationalities represented at Ecolint, 80 spoken languages, 4,500 students, about 6,500 parents, 1,300 staff. So there's about 10,000 people from nearly as many countries here as there are in the world. So whatever we do here, I'd like to believe, with some humility, is going to have an influence on the rest of the world.
I can see that. So it's a good-sized town. Now, Antonia, let me put the same question to you. Where are you from? How old are you? It's an indelicate question, but you're young anyway, so you don't mind answering that question. What year are you in at school, and what are you studying? And how did you end up here?
Well, as the Beatles song goes, I'm from here, there, and everywhere, I'd like to say. I was born in the heart of Manhattan in New York and later moved to Zurich, Switzerland at the age of 3 due to my parents' jobs. I am American, but as you can probably hear from my accent, I am a citizen of the world. I'm international. I do speak 5 languages. I attended my first school in Zurich. It was actually called Children First, symbolically. And I later moved to the inter-community school in Zurich, which is where I started my academic journey at the international school system. And in 2011, I believe, at the age of 7, I moved to Geneva, where I've been ever since. And I was super fortunate to be enrolled at Ecolint at the Châtaigneraie campus, where I'm currently studying. I'm in year 12, and I'm in my first year of the IB diploma, so the International Baccalaureate. And one of the things I love about the IB is the flexibility we have with our subjects. We really get a range of choices that we get to choose from, which leaves our opportunities quite open for the future. So I'm studying 6 subjects. I'm studying English literature at higher level, as well as history and French B. And at standard level, I'm studying mathematics, geography, and biology.
So you're busy, Antonia.
I
You're
am
busy.
indeed.
Good. David, let's go back to you now. Let's turn to current events, in particular the most momentous current event, COVID-19. We can't avoid that, I'm not talking the past tense, it's happening to us now. 1920 is already etched in history, though most of that generation have by now died. The so-called Spanish flu caused countless numbers to die, somewhere between 17 and 50 million, and even 100 million. The estimates are so vague, but it's truly enormous. Thousands and thousands of young men, scarcely much older than you, Antonia, survived the carnage of the Great War, 1914 to 18, were cut down by the flu on their way back home. It's just a tragic story. We can only wonder how history will record 2020. But what's happened in your school, David? I'm sure that you wouldn't disagree with me that it's a rather privileged environment. Money, resources, motivated teachers are not problems that you suffer from. But all the same, the pandemic was and is extraordinary. The school was founded just 4 years after the last great pandemic of 1920. So none of your team, just like the rest of us, had any idea what to do based on past personal experience. How did you manage, or how are you managing? What did you do differently, or what are you doing differently? And what has happened to the curriculum in the school across all the ages?
These are terrific questions, Michael. And I think for us, as a optimist at heart, and the way that I look at the world, I look at the challenges that COVID-19 has presented to us, and I look at the future and think about what can we take from this experience that is actually going to improve, if you will, as some people say, future-proof the experience of the young people who are with us today as students, and of course the teachers who are in charge of teaching them. And so it's given us an opportunity, certainly as adults, to think about what is it that we do here with our bricks and mortar and with being together, présentiel as they say in French, that cannot be done in front of a computer screen. Because from March till nearly June, we were online. And so what did we miss? What is unique in terms of what happens at a school? And I think fundamentally it got us to think about the power and importance of relationship, the power and importance of community, and also what is really worth knowing and being able to do and having a sense of agility for all of the disruptions that are likely to come in our future. And since you started with the question going back to the 1920s, we were formed in 1924, yes, the oldest international school in the world. And, you know, we've gone through a lot. Recently had a meeting with all of the staff, and I shared some of the periods in the in Ecolint's history, which included, of course, Reconstruction after World War I, living through World War II, when we took in refugees, our students became refugees, and for a time were actually learning on a boat. There was a time when we were growing our own food on the campus in order to survive. And we came out on the other side of that stronger. And my hope is, with respect to COVID-19, that's precisely what we are going to do today. Because it begs the question, what is the purpose of school when you can learn so much online?
But let me ask you something else before we go to Antonia. As your professional hand was forced by the sheer scale of the pandemic, how did you reason what to do? I mean by that, with your colleagues, how did you and your colleagues think through what to do when you're under pressure? Because that's the key. This has never happened before. You're a school with all these young people in your charge, okay? And you have a pressure on you because the authorities say, you must close. You must not do this. You must do it another way. How did you think that through? How did you reason?
Again, it goes back to the central questions of that have always challenged educators. And the first one, of course, is what's worth knowing? What's worth being, what is worth knowing how to do? And of course, what sort of person should one become? Those questions didn't disappear when we went into this lockdown, if you will. And the question then became, well, how do we approach the answers to those questions through our curriculum, through our interactions with students, when they're not in the same room with us? And so I think what we did, among other things, was we actually radically reduced the amount of time that was so-called synchronous, with all of the students on the screen with the teacher.
Say that word again?
Synchronous.
Synchronous, okay.
So that we thought about the moments that we were going to be together, how would we best use that? Do we always need to be together, meaning, let's say you've got a class of 20 children and a teacher, do they all need to be together at once, or is it better to have sometimes in small groups with the teacher, sometimes small groups with other groups of students? So we really got, in some ways, with no friction whatsoever, to experiment with lots of different ways of, if you will, delivering and having the students experience the curriculum.
Just to summarize quickly for me, because I'm going to ask the same question to Antonia. What do you think your young charges lost, and what do you think they gained in this hiatus between March and where we are now?
I think the main thing they gained was a sense of agency, meaning they were more and more in the driver's seat of their own education. Because when the computer switched off, it was really them with their families thinking about what it was that they wanted to learn.
But that must be for secondary education children, surely.
No, absolutely not. What was fascinating is that very early on, we switched to synchronous, to use that word again, with all age children, from 3 and 4-year-olds all the way up through our 18 and 19-year-olds, so that there were times when you weren't just consuming a one-way interaction from the teacher, a video from the teacher, but you were having some interactions, some storytelling, and so on.
So let's go to Antonia. What have been your observations since you're in the middle of the melee, the scrum, so to speak, since last night? What do you think you've lost, and what do you think you've gained?
Well, I think without shadow of doubt, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely had effects on our daily lives. And looking back, there are quite a number of things that I've lost and gained in the process.
Give me some examples.
Yeah, as Dr. Hawley stated before, we were online in March, as of March, until June. So I had the experience of doing school online. And I have to say it was a challenging experience. I think looking back, I really appreciate being in school now, having that face-to-face contact with my peers, with my teachers. Although online schooling was an interesting experience, I got to focus a bit more on myself in terms of my weaknesses, my strengths, and it was a really interesting way at looking at schooling. But once again, it makes me appreciate being back in school, and I know so many students across the globe haven't had that opportunity. But I think most importantly, what I learned, and I think once again Dr. Hawley said this, was the importance of relationships, the importance of the little things that sometimes go by and we don't really think of them. the relationships with my family. I was spending the whole day with my family. I was working from home on school, so was my younger brother. My dad was as well. But at the end of the day, we got to stay together. We got to have lunch together.
You're still talking to each other, are you?
We still did. It was a good experience between our Scrabble games, our Mario Kart tournaments, our walks. So I think just spending that family time was great.
Good.
Yeah.
My guests today are Dr. David Hawley, Director General of the International School of Geneva, and one of his secondary school students, Antonia Molnar, and we're at the Châtaigneraie campus in Funès in the canton of Vaud. David, we're by no means out of the woods yet, and even though as we speak, vaccination programs are being rolled out in the UK and a handful of other countries, I think even in the United States as of today, I believe. David, how does the future look to you as Director General, and how does the future look to your young charge? If I could ask you to put yourself, with the benefit of your age and many years of experience, in the position of your students. You're in mid-career, you've reached a very high level of attainment, though I'm sure you have many, many more years of great endeavour to give to education. But what's your vision of the future? How do you see the horizon?
It's a great question. I mean, part of the reason why Antonia is with us today is last year we spent the greater part of the year together with alumni, with teachers, with parents, thinking precisely about that question. What is it? What is our mission? What is our why in 2020, 2021 now? And we thought about, well, what is the purpose of school today? I'm going to reflect just a little bit. Many people know the popular writer Yuval Harari, and he's one of his books, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He has a chapter on education. And in the opening part of the chapter, he reflects on your question. You know, what is it that young people need to do today in order to best prepare themselves for a completely unknowable future? We know that it's going to be quite disruptive, and frankly, I think the COVID-19 is a kind of gift for them for the kinds of challenges that they face in the future. And the first thing he said was, if he were a young person today, he would advise that young person, don't pay much attention to somebody who's older, because they just don't get it. And so it's a pretty provocative thing to say, which is part of the reason why we have Antonia, who is part of this mission refresh team. But we asked this question to our original partners, UNESCO, the International Bureau of Education. They're our original partners in the 1920s when the League of Nations was being formed. They still exist. They've recently done a study with about 198 ministers of education all over the world, and they asked that question. And they came back with a rather big word, a big summary. They said, these are the 7 macro competences. These are the 7 things that if young people develop well, they are going to be well prepared for the future. So thinking 2050 and beyond. I'll say them very quickly.
Yes, please,
they're very simple.
I'm keeping an eye on
the first one
you know.
is the simplest of all, but the most important. And the first one is lifelong learners. The most important thing is young people, and in fact adults, really need to know how to learn.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the second one, which we've already discussed, is self-agency. So with those two things well in hand, we need to think about, are we delivering that experience to the students? Because we don't live in a world anymore where you go to school, you get prepared, you work, and then you retire. No, you're going to go through the cycle of learning and relearning and so on all through your lives.
So let's ask Antonia the same question, and maybe you missed out something. You're a couple of years away from going into higher education, university, college, whatever you choose. Let me ask you, what is your vision of the future, Antonia?
So I do plan on going to university either in the US or in the UK and studying law. However, my vision for the future, that's a big question. I'd say I'd like to take the values I've learned from Ecolint and really share them with everyone else. So I think one of the most important things would really be courage. I think the future needs courage, and the future needs a lot of kindness as well. I think we've seen that in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I'd say I'd love to give the opportunities I've had at this school to those around the world who haven't had the same opportunities as I've had, and I hope my peers will join me in doing the same thing, because I think it's great that I have these experiences, but in order to really progress and go into the future, in order have a better world, we all have to be involved, and it's a whole idea of community and an idea of togetherness that I'd love to share by sharing Ecolint's values and what I've learned here, to really be yourself, be courageous, be kind. I think in a few brief words, that's my vision for the future.
David, let me ask you again. It may sound like a slightly, it is a nuanced question, definitely so. But let me phrase it this way, and it's more widely than just education and schooling. What do you think is likely to change now we're going through and coming out of this COVID-19 because of what we're going through? What do you think must change? In other words, the imperative. And what do you think ought to change? In other words, if you had to use this very fashionable word now, agency, and what needs to happen for your answers and priorities as you see them to be realized? I'm curious to know how you see that.
I think the biggest change that I see projected into the future, and yes, I am going to angle it towards education, is thinking about, of course, every student there's no human being who is ever going to be like yourself. And we are all a unique gift to the world. And I think that we need increasingly to think about education as bringing out the best person that is, if you will, within each person. Let me try to unpack that so it doesn't sound just like a platitude. Right now, a lot of universities, unfortunately even a lot of parents, just thinking about it today, that's why I was late for this meeting, was they're looking at where are your students going to university? Well, it's a fair question. Absolutely. That's an important part of what we do. But what we're doing for universities is often doing a kind of sorting game for them, grading the students as if they're like eggs, using exams that I would argue are not the right way and the right measure of a human being. And so one of the things we're trying to do to disrupt the future is these competences that I was mentioning, is to have students create their own, what we're calling the learner passport, where they do the equivalent of stamp their own passport, demonstrating what they have accomplished, from where they began, what they've accomplished, so that they can bring that to a university and say, this is how far I've come so far. This is why I want to go to university, because I want to take this further, as opposed to, these are my grades, let me in.
Antonia, has he missed anything out? Would you go along with that? I mean, you're free to disagree. I mean, that's the whole point of an open debate.
No, I would actually agree with what most of what Dr. Hawley has said.
And where's your reservation?
No, I think I'd just like to add a few things. I wouldn't disagree with anything in particular. I think what I'd say is the whole mentality behind learning, I think, has to change a little bit, because we are in a school, of course, but I think there's so much more than just exams. It's really, I think learning is definitely a lifelong process. I learn things every day, and I think it's really more about experiences, the experiences we have. I mean, we're an international school, we're in Geneva, we have so many opportunities around us, we're surrounded, we're right in the middle of that, and I think if we could take advantage of that just a little bit more, in order to really ensure that we get the experience of being, a global citizen, of being even a citizen of Geneva, citizen of Switzerland, I think it's important to get in touch with everyone around us and really think about the future and about the values that we have as people, because one size doesn't fit all. We're all different. At the end of the day, exams aren't going to define who we are. It's really about the impacts we have on society, on community, that I think is really important.
That's a good answer. David, I'm going to move on to something different as we come to the end of our conversation, because you mentioned at the beginning the word relationships, and you mentioned very briefly in passing community, but I want to focus a little bit on community, because it's something which I've always had thoughts about, having put my kids through this system here, and having had them in another system. It's a privileged school in the community. One only has to look at the level of fees. I think at the top end, it's 35,000 Swiss a year. I see the cars that drop the children off to school in the morning, because I live not far from the school. But what does community mean to an international school which is essentially not a neighborhood school, like the state or public system? And I speak with some knowledge because my children were in both systems, and it's something which I'm curious about. Are you part of the community here in Vaud, in Fune? Tell me what goes on in that relationship. And if I asked the people in the village, are they at Le Chat part of the community, what do you think they would say? Tell me what you think about that.
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the challenges for all international schools is for us not to have this image of the big, wider world and miss what's just outside our gates. I mean, a good example is I think we should all be speaking, as most of us do, the local language, so that everyone here, even a student coming in from Japan, should be learning French as well as learning English here, as a commitment to being connected and having the ability to be connected to the local community. So you will see in our curriculum our connectivity to the local community in many, many different ways, not just casually visiting museums, but being engaged with the community in areas of need. I'm really pleased to say that we have relaunched a scholarship program at Ecolint. You've mentioned fees a couple of times. One of the visions I have for Ecolint, I'd love to see us have a significant enough endowment that one of the ways that we are diverse is not just by nations, but that we are truly socioeconomically diverse. And for example, we have 4 of our 5 scholarship students today are refugee students who've settled here in Geneva, who don't have the means to come to Ecolint through their family financially. And through a very competitive application process, we found 4 refugees of extraordinary promise and potential, and they've got scholarships to come to Ecolint, and we think that that's an enriching experience for our students. So we've got quite, and maybe right here in La Châtaigneraie, you will know we have lots of lectures. We bring in people from around the world. We invite the local community to those presentations, to those performances.
That's
we were
good.
very public about that.
Okay. So just my last couple of questions, and we're going to give Antonia the last word. But this, related to my previous question, it's Theresa May, former British Prime Minister, who famously made a controversial remark. If you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, she said. She had political reasons for that jibe at the time, because she was jibing at the elites, who also happen often to be the society's decision makers, rather than the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. But David, what do you make of that kind of remark coming from a senior politician? And does it teach or inform you in any way about how you must prepare and coach your global youngsters, like Antonia here? And then we'll come to you, Antonia, on that.
You know, in some ways, this is a question that's better for Antonia, because my understanding, having a couple of children myself, is that the orientation to the world that a lot of young people have is more about issues and causes as opposed to things that are, let's say, focused on politics, although that's a very important thing. So I'll let her speak to that a bit. But when we say in our mission that we are educating global citizens with the courage and capacity to create a just and joyful tomorrow together, which is our new mission expression, when we say global citizen, a global citizen is someone who lives and exists in the world in such a way that she or he thinks about their impact on people right next to them and people all over the world. And I think the challenges that we have today globally are based on our individual decisions. There's no escaping. That's one of the beauties of the lessons of COVID-19, of how truly interconnected and interdependent we are. We cannot eat a piece of fish these days without the microplastics that we've all contributed to. So the connectivity that we have to each other can only be realized if we see ourselves as global citizens, and we also need to have some roots that are local and in the community.
So Antonio, you got the last word. Now, you've already told me that you've lived in lots of different places for someone so young. My children went through the same kind of purgatory as well. But I have a particular question to ask you as we close. Do you have social contact with young people your age who've been in one place for all of their first 16 years? Just as when I was growing up, I lived in one place until I went to college. Okay, do you ever compare notes with those young people, your contemporaries? And what have you discovered in talking to your local contemporaries who go to local schools?
I do actually. So I've taken dance classes, and I've been lucky to interact with students and children my age who I've gotten to become good friends with who go to the local schools, and they've lived here their whole lives. And I think in the beginning there was a bit of an image they had of me coming from an international school, not speaking French as my mother tongue. I think they did think I was a bit pushed out of the community, not exactly. They didn't really know how to interact. They thought I was a bit of an outsider, I think, in the beginning. But I think after they talked to me and they realized who I was, and in essence, we were quite similar, actually. We did share the same values. We talk about the same things. We watch the same movies. We are quite similar. I think one of the differences I did see was because of my international background. I had a different awareness and a different perspective on some of the things. I mean, even the judgment factor, how they judged me just because I didn't speak French. I didn't go to the same school as them, so that was a bit different. But in the end, we are quite similar, and I think that was an important takeaway. It was a lesson for me because maybe I think I could have interacted a bit more, but I did tell them about our school and the values and the thoughts that we have and the perspective that we have, and I think it was interesting for them to see that as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There you have it. Listeners, the voice of the future. We could talk a lot longer, but thanks to both of you for making time for me today and for being so open and honest in your replies and to my questions. My guests today have been Dr. David Hawley, the Director General of the International School of Geneva, and Antonia Molnar, one of his students. Many thanks to both of you, and have a happy new year.
Thank you, Michael. Same to you.
Thank you.